A crying baby in the wrong place at the wrong time. A terrified mother facing the most dangerous man in Chicago. And then, something impossible happened. The child who screamed at everyone suddenly smiled at the man with blood still fresh on his hands. What she did next will leave you breathless. Stay with me, because this story will change how you see monsters and the people brave enough to love them. This story will prove that sometimes the coldest hearts are simply waiting for the right person to melt them, and that true family is not built by blood, but by love and choice. If you believe in second chances, hit like right now, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that touches your soul. The screams from Fern were relentless. In the cavernous cross mansion, the sound ricocheted off the polished marble walls, echoing like a final judgment about to be rendered. "Please, my love, be quiet," Soline pleaded. Her voice was a fragile whisper as she clutched her daughter tightly. Her work uniform was damp with perspiration, and a fire burned in her arms from rocking the 11-month-old child for what felt like an eternity, but was only 40 minutes. Yet her efforts were futile. They always were when Fern began to cry. At the far end of the hall, Mrs. Thornberry materialized, her expression a mask of pure terror. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, her voice low and urgent. "His office is right there. He can hear every single sound." A knot of ice formed in Soline's stomach. She knew exactly who he was. Stellan Cross. They called him the Phantom, a man who had constructed his vast empire upon the remains of anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. She had accepted this position from the depths of her desperation, facing 4 months of overdue rent notices, medical expenses for Fern's early birth that were piling up, and a violent ex-partner who had simply vanished, leaving behind only his debts and her bruises. She had no other option. "I tried to arrange for someone to watch her," Soline explained, her voice barely audible as hot tears stung her eyes. "The babysitter had an emergency. I have called everyone I know. There is nobody else. You will not have a life to worry about if he finds." The rest of Mrs. Thornberry's warning was swallowed by fear. Somewhere deeper in the mansion, a heavy door slammed shut. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were measured, heavy, and drawing closer with each beat of Celine's heart. "Run," Mrs. Thornberry mouthed silently, before vanishing around the corner as if she were made of mist. But Celine was paralyzed. Her feet felt as if they were encased in solid stone. All she could do was stand there, holding her wailing child, as Stellan Cross came into view and halted. He was a larger man than she had pictured, with a broader frame and a brutal scar that carved a path down the left side of his face from his temple to his jaw, a pale line against his skin. His eyes held the color and coldness of a winter lake. The black suit he wore likely cost more than Soline's annual salary. Then, her gaze caught on a dark stain. It was blood on his knuckles. It was fresh. When he spoke, his voice was a low murmur, yet it struck her with the force of a physical blow. Soline flinched. It felt as if he had screamed at her. "I am so sorry, sir. I understand she should not be here. My nanny had a family emergency, and I could not find a replacement, and I simply cannot lose this job. My daughter, she needs her medication. Be quiet." The words cut through her rambling, and Soline's mouth clamped shut. Fern, however, continued her shrill sobs, her small frame shaking from the effort. Stellan's icy gaze shifted down to the infant. For a brief moment, an unreadable emotion flickered in his eyes. "How old is she?" 11 months, sir. She arrived prematurely. She was in the neonatal intensive care unit for 2 long months. She is terrified of new people. I am the only one who can hold her. Even for medical exams, the doctors are forced to sedate her. She is afraid of everyone. I am explaining this because, without another word, Stellan reached a hand toward Fern. A cold dread seized Soline's chest. "Sir, please do not. She will only cry harder. You will make it so much worse. I am begging you, please, just allow me to go. I promise I will never bring her here again. I will find another solution." And then Fern's crying ceased. The abrupt quiet was so profound it felt like a physical blow, and Celine forgot to draw a breath. Her daughter's head came up from her shoulder. Fern's large blue eyes, still glistening with tears, fixed on Stellan Cross with a profound and baffling focus. Then, the impossible happened. Fern smiled. In her entire 11 months of life, Celine had never witnessed her daughter smile at a person she did not know. Yet here she was, beaming at this terrifying man, extending both of her little arms towards him, her fingers opening and closing in a clear gesture. "No," Celine whispered in disbelief. "Baby, please no." Fern let out a small whine and wriggled, fighting against her mother's hold to get to Stellan. Her tiny body strained in his direction, her hands grasping at the air. She wanted to be held by him. This man of violence, this feared phantom. Her own daughter wanted him. "Hand her to me," Stellan commanded. "Sir, I cannot." But Celine found herself obeying. Perhaps it was the terror he inspired. Perhaps it was the absolute confidence in his tone. Or perhaps it was the way Fern gazed at him, as if he were the only bastion of safety in the entire world. She placed her child into the arms of Chicago's most feared predator. And Fern, her previously inconsolable, terrified of everyone baby girl, immediately wrapped her small arms around Stellan Cross's thick neck and released a soft sigh of utter contentment. The notorious crime boss remained perfectly still. His bloodied hand hovered hesitantly over the baby's small back. His glacial gaze had widened in pure disbelief. For a single, unbelievable moment, he appeared almost vulnerable. "She has never, ever done that before," Celine said, her voice full of awe, "not with anyone." Stellan offered no response. He just continued to stand there, holding this small, precious life against his powerful chest, looking like a man who had been given a treasure he had no idea how to protect. If your heart skipped a beat just now, make sure you hit that like button. Share this tale with a friend who appreciates a good plot twist. And hit subscribe because you will not want to miss what happens next. It proves that sometimes the most dangerous arms can offer the greatest safety. Without a word, Stellan pivoted and started down the hall, not waiting for Celine. Fern remained securely in his arms. She was clinging to his neck, her blue eyes closed tightly, her breathing deep and even, as though she had discovered the one place she truly belonged. Celine was frozen for a moment, her thoughts struggling to make sense of the unbelievable scene. Then, her body acted on its own accord. Her feet began to move, following the formidable man who carried her child with an air of complete normalcy. They proceeded down a long, immense hallway, flanked by priceless oil paintings and elaborate floral displays in perfect condition. Every one of Stellan's footsteps resonated with a powerful calm on the marble floors. In contrast, every one of Celine's steps was a tremor of uncertainty behind him. He pushed open a set of large oak doors, and Celine crossed the threshold into another reality. Stellan Cross's private office was larger than the entire cramped apartment she called home. The ceiling was impossibly high, adorned with a magnificent crystal chandelier. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic vista of the Chicago skyline at night. The city's skyscrapers sparkled like a glittering forest of steel and glass. The walnut floor gleamed with such a high polish that Celine could see the distorted shape of her own face in its surface. A huge black mahogany desk dominated the center of the space, holding nothing more than a sleek laptop and a vintage brass lamp. An entire wall was consumed by a towering bookshelf, packed with leather-bound books that seemed untouched. But it was not the opulence that made her blood run cold. In a corner of the office was a glass-fronted cabinet that reached from the floor almost to the ceiling. Displayed inside on mounts of black velvet were no fewer than 20 firearms. There were handguns, rifles, and other weapons whose names she did not know. They shone under the recessed lighting, obviously maintained with the same reverence as cherished artifacts. Celine's throat went dry. This was his reality, a realm built on violence, power, and finality, and her daughter was now sleeping soundly in the embrace of the man who commanded it all. "Sit," Stellan said, his chin gesturing to a black leather chair. It was positioned directly across from the desk. Celine obeyed. There was no other choice. Stellan moved to the other side of the desk, one arm still a sturdy support for Fern, and eased his large frame into the executive chair. He shifted the baby's weight with an unexpected tenderness, resting her head comfortably on his shoulder. His large hand spread across almost the entirety of Fern's small back. The dried blood on his knuckles left a faint smear on his tailored suit. He paid it no mind. Stellan's cold gray gaze found hers and held it captive. In the focused light of the office, the scar on his face was even more prominent. It was a fierce, uneven line that told a story of brutality she could not begin to comprehend. His voice, when he spoke, was still quiet and still deeply unsettling. "You will now explain to me what possessed you to bring a child into my home." Celine took a shaky breath. Every instinct told her to invent a story, to create a fiction that was less pathetic. But his stare seemed to peel back every layer of her defenses. It felt as though he could see every secret she held. She knew, with absolute certainty, that lying to this man would be a fatal error. "My daughter's regular caregiver called me at 5 this morning," she started, her voice raspy with strain. "Her mother suffered a stroke. She had to get on a plane to Florida right away. I made 17 phone calls." 17. Not a single person was available. Why? Stellan's question was sharp, his eyes unblinking. "Why was no one available to help you?" "Because I do not have anyone," Celine admitted, and she heard her own voice fracture with emotion. "My parents were killed in a car crash when I was 16 years old. I have no brothers or sisters, no other family. My friends, they disappeared a long time ago because—" Her words faltered. "Because what?" "Because of my ex-boyfriend." Celine looked down at her hands, which were twisted together in her lap. "He did not approve of me having friends. He did not like it when I spoke to other people. He did not permit me to do anything that he had not explicitly allowed." An oppressive silence filled the room. When Celine finally looked up again, a subtle shift had occurred in the depths of Stellan's gaze. It was still cold, still impenetrable, but now a darker, more dangerous energy radiated from them. "He put his hands on you." It was not a question. It was a declaration. Celine could only nod, a painful lump forming in her throat. "For 2 years, I was too afraid to leave. He promised he would end my life if I tried. Then, I learned I was pregnant." Her eyes darted to Fern, who was still in a deep sleep on Stellan's shoulder, completely oblivious to the terrible history her mother was now revealing. "He attacked me when I was 7 months along. The assault was so severe that I ended up in the hospital. She was born 2 months before she was due. She weighed under 2 kilograms. The doctors told me she might not make it." Celine's voice broke on a sob. Fern was in an incubator for 62 days. For 62 days that felt like a lifetime, I sat by her side, praying and pleading with any power that might be listening to just let my daughter live. And during all of that, he simply vanished. He saddled me with his gambling losses. He left me with all the hospital bills. He abandoned me in an apartment with 4 months of back rent due. Tears were now flowing freely down Celine's face, but she made no move to wipe them away. She was far too exhausted to hold on to her pride any longer. Fern's immune system was incredibly fragile, a result of being born prematurely. She required constant medication. She needed frequent doctor visits. She needed so many things that I simply could not provide. I lost 3 different jobs because I had to take days off to care for her whenever she fell ill. Looking up, she met Stellan's gaze directly. This job, this very job, was my final hope. If I lose this position, my daughter and I will be forced to live on the streets. So yes, I was fully aware that bringing her here was a reckless act. I knew exactly who you are. I understood you could end my life for this small inconvenience. But I truly had no other option. When I had to choose between a guaranteed termination and a small possibility of being killed, I chose the possibility. because with that chance, at least there was a glimmer of hope. Celine fell silent, her breathing rapid and shallow. She had said far too much, and she knew it. But the moment she started speaking, she couldn't hold back. Everything she had suppressed for almost 2 years burst forth like a collapsing dam. A heavy silence filled the office. Stellan remained completely still. He only observed her with an expression she could not decipher. One of his arms still cradled Fern, his thumb gently stroking the child's back without conscious thought. Fern began to stir in her sleep, letting out a soft murmur before wrapping her arms more tightly around Stellan's neck. Celine witnessed it for just a fraction of a second. Stellan's expression softened as he glanced down at the small child in his arms, but the moment passed and his icy demeanor returned. "What is his name?" Stellan demanded, his voice lowering into something truly menacing. "The man who did this to you. Tell me his name." Celine went rigid. She understood immediately that his question was not driven by simple curiosity. It was a promise. It was a promise of brutal violence, of cold revenge, of unspeakable things that would happen if she uttered a name. Celine shook her head firmly. "It makes no difference," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "He is gone. I have no idea where he is, and I have no desire to find out." Stellan observed her for a long, tense moment, his gray eyes as sharp as steel blades. Celine had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that he did not believe a word she was saying, or that he knew she was concealing a crucial part of the truth. But he chose not to push her for more information. Not at this moment. He rose to his feet, still holding Fern as though the child weighed nothing more than a feather. He walked over to the large window, looking down at the glittering city lights spread out below them. Fern shifted again, her head moving to find a more comfortable spot on his shoulder before she settled back into a deep sleep. Stellan remained there in complete silence for what felt like an eternity, but was likely a full minute. Celine did not dare to make a sound. She hardly dared to breathe. She just sat perfectly still, awaiting her judgment. Fired. Or something far worse. She had mentally prepared for either outcome. "You and your daughter will be moving in here." For a moment, Celine was convinced she had heard him incorrectly. What was that? "There is a private apartment located in the east wing of the estate," Stellan explained, his back still turned to her. "It has 2 bedrooms and comes fully furnished. You will move in this afternoon." Celine jumped to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir, I am confused. What are you talking about?" "I am saying you are going to live here." Stellan finally turned around, his expression as cold as marble. "I will also hire a professional nanny who will care for the child during your working hours. I will take care of all her medical expenses, and you will no longer need to concern yourself with paying rent." The entire room started to feel like it was spinning around Celine. This situation made absolutely no sense. Powerful men like Stellan Cross never offered help without a hidden motive, without expecting something in return. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Why are you offering to do all of this? You know nothing about me. I am just a cleaner. I cannot understand your reasoning." "It is because of the child," Stellan interrupted, his gaze shifting down to Fern. "She trusts me. She has no reason to trust me. Nobody should ever trust me. And yet, she does." He paused for a beat, his thumb still absently rubbing the child's back. "That is a feeling I am not accustomed to." Celine had no idea how to respond. She just stood there, watching the most feared man in Chicago hold her little girl with a tenderness she had never witnessed from anyone, not even from Fern's own father. "But I cannot accept your offer," she finally managed to say. "I refuse to be indebted to you. I do not want to. This is not an offer you can refuse." Stellan took a step toward her, and Celine had to fight the powerful urge to retreat. He came to a stop directly in front of her, his large frame towering over her by nearly a foot, casting a dark shadow over her. You do not possess the right to decline. A surge of defiance boiled in Celine's blood, pushing past her fear. Then what does that make me? She challenged, her voice coming out stronger than she had intended. Am I just another piece in your games? Am I something you think you can purchase with your money? I am not. You are a mother who is starving herself so that her daughter has enough to eat, Stellan countered, his voice sharp and cold. You are a woman getting by on 3 hours of sleep a night because you have to work 2 separate jobs. You are someone who is willing to stand before me, to face death itself, because you were left with no other path. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes scrutinizing her. I am not trying to buy you. I am presenting you with an opportunity. Whether you accept it is entirely up to you. But if you turn this down because of some misplaced pride while your daughter is in desperate need of medicine, then you are far worse than any of the men I have put in the ground. His words hit Celine with the force of a physical blow. She desperately wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she did not need his charity. But just then, Fern stirred in his arms, making a small, contented sound in her sleep, and every last bit of pride Celine had left crumbled into dust. She looked at her daughter, so small and fragile, her skin pale and her body thin. Always sick because Celine could not buy the proper medication. Always sleeping on a bare mattress in a freezing apartment because Celine could not afford to pay for heating. Her child deserves so much more than a life of struggle. All right, Celine whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I will do it. For Fern. I will stay, but only for Fern. Stellan simply nodded, as if this outcome had been decided from the very beginning. Mrs. Thornberry will show you to the apartment, he stated. Your things will be brought over within the next 2 hours. The new nanny is scheduled to start tomorrow morning. He glanced down at Fern one last time. For just an instant, Celine thought she saw a hint of warmth in those icy eyes. And now, he said, let the child get some rest. She seems to like it here. It was not just an apartment. It was a fantasy Celine had never allowed herself to imagine. When Mrs. Thornberry opened the grand oak door, Celine had to lean against the wall to keep her legs from giving out. The living area was immense, furnished with plush cream velvet couches, deep fur rugs, and massive windows that offered a view of the estate's flawlessly kept gardens. In the open-concept kitchen, the refrigerator was stocked completely full of food, the kind of fresh and expensive food Celine had not been able to purchase in many months. There was fresh fruit, whole milk, and cuts of beef. She had to turn away quickly so Mrs. Thornberry would not notice the tears welling in her eyes. The main bedroom featured a large double bed made up with crisp white linens and a feather duvet so soft and thick that Celine felt an overwhelming urge to collapse onto it and weep. But it was the second bedroom that truly shattered her composure. It was Fern's room. The walls were a soft mint green, adorned with hand-painted butterflies and flowers that seemed to flutter around the window frame. A pristine white crib with a thick, cushioned mattress and soft blankets was situated in the corner. Nearby shelves were overflowing with stuffed animals, vibrant stacking blocks, and soft cloth books designed for infants. When she opened the wardrobe, she found rows of tiny outfits, including dresses, rompers, socks, and hats, all of them brand new and all of them in Fern's exact size. She organized all of this for you, Mrs. Thornberry explained, her tone noticeably warmer than Celine had ever heard it before. Just 2 hours later, Celine was standing in the center of the room as tears streamed unchecked down her face. She thought about her old apartment, where Fern had to sleep on a thin, worn mattress on the cold floor. She remembered layering 3 old, threadbare blankets over her child because she had no money for the heating bill. She recalled all the nights she lay awake, listening to her daughter cry from the biting cold, feeling like the most inadequate mother in the entire world. And now there was this beautiful room, this incredible warmth. She had no idea what she was supposed to feel. Was it gratitude or was it fear? It was both. A sharp knock on the door startled Celine from her reverie. She hastily wiped away her tears and went to open it. A woman of Asian descent stood in the doorway. She appeared to be in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun at the base of her neck. Her expression was serene, but her eyes were as sharp as daggers. She was dressed in a simple black pantsuit, yet her posture and the way she scanned her surroundings suggested she was anything but ordinary. "I am Miss Hayashi," she introduced herself, her voice both gentle and commanding. "I will be Fern's new nanny, starting tomorrow. Mr. Cross requested that I come and introduce myself to you beforehand." Celine gestured for her to come inside, still trying to get a sense of this mysterious woman. Miss Hayashi entered the apartment with the cautious grace of a predator, her gaze sweeping over every corner as if she were assessing for threats. "Do you have much experience with children?" Celine inquired. "I have a great deal of experience with many different things," Miss Hayashi responded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You have no reason to be concerned. Fern will be completely safe in my care." The specific way she emphasized the word safe sent an odd chill down Celine's spine, not from alarm, but from the sudden certainty that Miss Hayashi was much more than just a nanny. That evening, after she fed Fern and laid her down in the new crib, Celine was wide awake, staring into the darkness of the luxurious room. Nothing felt real. Just this morning, she was a cleaner, terrified of being fired and thrown onto the street. Now, she was surrounded by silk sheets with a thread count she couldn't even comprehend. It was an injustice of cosmic scale. A soft noise from the hallway made her bolt upright, every muscle tensed. Footsteps. They stopped right outside her apartment door. She slid from the bed without a sound, her bare feet cold on the polished floor, and crept toward the entrance. She held her breath, refusing to open it, and instead pressed her eye to the peephole. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was him. Stellan Cross was standing just outside her door. He made no move to knock or announce himself. He just stood there in the dimly lit hall, his gaze fixed on her door, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. His hand rose, paused mid-air, as if he was about to rap his knuckles on the wood, but then it dropped. It lifted again, only to fall once more. For almost 5 minutes he remained there, a silent, menacing statue, before he finally turned and vanished into the corridor's deep shadows. Celine sagged against the door, a tremor running through her. She had no idea what that powerful, dangerous man wanted from her. What could possibly bring him to her door in the dead of night? All she knew for certain was that her life was irrevocably changed, and she needed to understand why. The first week unfolded like a surreal fantasy, the kind she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to escape. Her role in the estate transformed overnight. There was no more kneeling to scrub floors or polishing endless glass panels. Instead, Mrs. Thornberry installed her at a small, neat desk in the administrative wing. Her days were now spent organizing sensitive documents, sorting private correspondence, and learning to navigate the complicated inner workings of the Cross Empire. The labor was not hard on her body, but it was a heavy weight on her mind. Every document felt like a loaded weapon. Every name represented a secret life. She quickly learned the unspoken rules. Never ask questions, never stare, and above all, never show any curiosity about the grim meetings that happened behind the closed doors of Stellan's office. But the work was not what occupied her thoughts. It was the evenings. Every single night at precisely 7 o'clock, never a minute early or late, a firm knock would sound at her door. And every time Celine opened it, she found Stellan Cross standing on her threshold. He offered no explanation for his presence. He never requested entry. He would simply step over the threshold, his gaze fixed on Fern, and move to sit down beside her. For 15 minutes. Every evening, he stayed for exactly 15 minutes. On the very first night, Celine remained frozen in a corner of the room, her body rigid with apprehension and suspicion. She was at a complete loss for what to do or say, but her daughter was not. The second that little Fern saw Stellan, her bright blue eyes widened with pure delight. She scrambled toward him with an incredible speed for her tiny limbs, her little arms reaching up to be held. And Stellan Cross, the most feared and ruthless mafia boss in all of Chicago, leaned down and scooped her into his arms as if it were the most normal act in the world. Fern instantly hugged his neck, nestling her head against his broad shoulder while making soft, happy gurgles. Stellan himself rarely spoke. He might ask a brief question, his voice low, about whether she was eating or sleeping properly, but his questions were aimed at Celine, while his intense eyes remained locked on Fern. For the rest of the time, he would just sit and hold the little girl, allowing her to tug on his expensive tie or pat his stern cheek with her tiny, soft hand. During his third visit, Fern actually drifted off to sleep against Stellan's shoulder. He stayed perfectly still for more than 20 minutes, barely seeming to breathe, terrified that any small movement might disturb her rest. When he finally rose to place Fern in her crib, his actions were so incredibly gentle, so full of care. Celine found it impossible to reconcile these hands with the ones that had surely ended lives. The strange new routine did not go unnoticed. Rumors began to circulate through the massive estate like a contagion. Celine caught fragments of them in hushed conversations in the kitchen staff areas, and saw them in the shocked expressions of servants she passed in the halls. "He goes to see the child every single night," one maid whispered in disbelief. "I cannot believe it. Who is this child that he would show such concern for? It cannot be his, can it?" Another servant scoffed. "It is just the cleaner's infant, but the baby clings to him as if he were her own father." The only person who showed no surprise at all was Mrs. Thornberry. "In the 20 years I have worked for the Cross family, I have never witnessed him behave this way," she confided in Celine on the 5th day, as they were organizing records. "He has no fondness for children. He has no fondness for anyone getting close to him. But Fern," she trailed off, shaking her head with a look that was a mixture of confusion and sheer awe. "That little girl has some kind of effect on him. I do not understand it, but he is a different man around her." Celine had no idea what to say, because she was witnessing the very same transformation. In the evenings when Stellan held Fern, the harsh lines of his face would relax. It was not a huge change, just a subtle softening, but it was enough for Celine to see a flicker of the human being hidden behind the wall of ice. It was enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about him. Then, on the 7th night, as Stellan was getting ready to leave, Fern suddenly began to wail. She grabbed onto his suit jacket with her tiny fists, refusing to release him as fat tears streamed down her plump cheeks. Stellan just stood there, completely helpless, staring down at the heartbroken child with an expression Celine had never witnessed on him before. It was a look of confusion and profound pain, as if Fern's sobs were physically tearing him apart from the inside. "I will be back," he said to the child, his voice much rougher than normal. "Tomorrow. I give you my word." Fern could not understand his promise, but she understood his tone. Her crying subsided into small hiccups, and she reached a small hand up to touch his face. Stellan squeezed his eyes shut for a single fleeting second, but that moment conveyed more than 1,000 words ever could. After he left that evening, Celine stood by the window, watching his powerful form disappear down the corridor. She replayed what Mrs. Thornberry had said about the change she saw in him, about the man hidden beneath the fearsome mafia boss. And for the very first time since arriving in this dangerous place, she felt an emotion that was not fear. It was something infinitely more perilous. It was curiosity. 2 nights later, on the 9th night, Celine's worst fears materialized. She was jolted from her sleep at 2 in the morning by a faint cry from the adjacent room. This was not Fern's normal sound. This was a weak, painful whimper that sent a spear of ice through Celine's heart. She threw herself from the bed and raced into her daughter's room, and her world crumbled. Fern was lying in her crib, her face a frightening shade of crimson, her hair matted with sweat. When Celine pressed a hand to her forehead, a strangled gasp escaped her lips. She was on fire, burning up, "Oh no, please no," Celine sobbed, her hands trembling uncontrollably, as she carefully lifted her daughter from the crib. Fern let out a feeble cry, her head lolling against her mother's shoulder as her small body was racked with shivers. Her breathing was dangerously rapid and shallow, and each tiny gasp felt like a knife twisting in Celine's soul. She had witnessed this exact scene once before, in the sterile nightmare of an intensive care unit right after Fern was born. She remembered the frantic energy of the doctors, the worried looks they failed to conceal, a compromised immune system, they had explained to her then. They had warned her that what might be a simple fever for another child could be a death sentence for Fern. Celine clutched her daughter even tighter, hot tears blurring her vision. She had no money for an ambulance. She had no health insurance. She had absolutely no one in the world to turn to. "You are going to be fine, my love," she whispered, unsure if she was trying to comfort Fern or herself. "Mommy will figure something out. I promise Mommy will." Suddenly, the bedroom door was thrown open with tremendous force. She spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. Stellan Cross filled the doorway, his dark hair a mess, his shirt rumpled as if he had just leapt out of bed. His piercing gray eyes scanned the room, then locked onto the sick child in her arms, and a terrifying protective fury ignited within them. "What is wrong?" His voice was as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "She has a fever," Celine stammered, her own voice cracking with despair. "A very high fever. I do not know what to do. I do not have the money to get a doctor. I cannot—" Before she could even finish her sentence, Stellan had his phone out. He dialed a number and spoke only 4 words into it. "Get here. Right now." Then he disconnected the call and strode toward Celine. "Give her to me." Without a single moment of hesitation, Celine transferred her daughter into his strong arms. Incredibly, Fern's crying ceased almost instantly. Her breathing was still rapid, her skin still blazing hot, but the desperate sobs stopped, as if just being held by Stellan made the pain somehow manageable. "The doctor will arrive in 15 minutes, Stellan stated, his intense gaze never leaving Fern's face. "He is my personal physician, the best in all of Chicago. She is going to be fine." He spoke the words like a royal decree, as if he was commanding the universe itself to keep this child from harm. Sure enough, 12 minutes later, a professional, middle-aged man with a medical bag appeared at the door. He conducted a swift, expert examination of Fern, administered medication, and gave clear instructions on how to bring the fever down. "It is a mild respiratory infection," he explained. "Not a major concern for a healthy child, but given her delicate immune system, she will require very close observation. I will check on her again first thing in the morning." After the doctor departed, Celine finally released a ragged, shuddering breath of relief. But Stellan made no move to leave. He simply sat down in the chair next to Fern's crib, still cradling the sleeping child, and fixed his gaze on Celine. "Go and get some sleep," he commanded softly. "I will stay and watch over her." Celine immediately shook her head. "I cannot possibly sleep. She is sick. I need to be here." "You need to rest," Stellan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You are on the verge of collapsing from exhaustion. You will be of no use to her if you become ill yourself." A part of her wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She was utterly spent, emotionally and physically terrified. It felt like she had not had a proper night's sleep in years. And now, seeing Stellan Cross sitting vigil with Fern in his arms, his expressions serious and focused, she experienced a feeling she had not known in a very, very long time. She felt safe. She did not leave the room. She could not bring herself to. Instead, she slid down to the floor, rested her back against the cool wall, and finally allowed herself to fall into an exhausted sleep, while the most dangerous man she had ever met kept watch over her child. When she finally awoke, the first pale rays of dawn were filtering through the curtains. Stellan was still in the chair, in the exact same position. He had not moved the entire night. Fern was sleeping peacefully on his chest, her breathing now calm and even. The feverish color had faded from her cheeks. Stellan himself looked exhausted, with dark circles etched beneath his eyes from the lack of sleep. He was gazing down at the child with an expression that Celine could not quite decipher. It was a mixture of tenderness, fierce protection, and a deep, profound pain, as if he were looking at something precious that he was certain he did not deserve. "Do not give up, little one," he whispered, so quietly he did not know Celine could hear him. "You are so much stronger than you know. You must be stronger than you know." His voice broke on the last words, and he had to pause for a moment to compose himself. And Celine, sitting in the silent dawn, felt tears begin to stream down her own face. But these were not tears of fear. They were something else entirely, because she had just seen something that perhaps no one else ever would. She had seen the breaking heart of Stellan Cross. Fern made a full recovery in 3 days. Over those 3 days, Stellan visited not just once, but twice each day, once in the morning and once in the evening, to personally check on the child's progress. For 3 days, his private physician was available at a moment's notice, providing expensive medicines that she knew were far beyond her reach. Throughout those 3 days, she began to see this imposing man in a completely new light. On the 4th day, when Fern was well enough to smile and play again, Stellan had Celine brought to his office. She stood in front of his massive desk, her back held perfectly straight, trying her best to project an image of calm, even as her heart raced inside her chest. She had no clue what he wanted from her. Perhaps he had grown weary of their new arrangement. Perhaps he was about to send her away. "Perhaps you are a very observant person," Stellan said without warning, his words slicing through her anxious thoughts. Celine blinked in confusion. "Sir? Yesterday, while the doctor was examining Fern, you were standing over in the corner." Stellan got up from his chair and started to walk toward, facing the window with his back turned to her. "What did you observe?" Celine found the question confusing for a moment, but then she replayed the entire encounter in her head. The physician attending to Fern, her own silent watching, and the details she had picked up on. "He was terrified," she said with deliberate slowness. "Not for Fern, but about something else entirely. He kept looking at the time on his watch. His hand had a slight tremor as he wrote out the prescription, and just before he departed, he shot a look toward the main gate like he was afraid someone was waiting for him out there." Stellan pivoted, his gray eyes as sharp as blades. "What more?" Celine paused for a heartbeat. His phone buzzed 3 separate times while he was conducting the examination. He never answered it, but after each vibration, his gaze darted toward the door. "And the very last time, I saw him swallow hard, as if he was truly scared." A heavy silence filled the room. Stellan scrutinized her, his expression impossible to decipher. Then he gave a slow nod, a faint smile touching his lips. "That physician has a massive gambling problem," he stated. "Loan sharks are applying immense pressure on him. I uncovered this information last week, yet you saw it all in just 10 minutes." Minutes. Celine felt completely lost, unsure of how she should possibly respond. She just remained standing in place, waiting for him to continue. "You possess a sharp intellect," Stellan went on, taking a step toward her. "You managed to survive for 2 years with a man who hurt you. You raised your child completely on your own, starting with absolutely nothing. You stood before me with courage when every other person on this estate is frozen with fear." He came to a stop directly in front of her, so close that she could see the severe lines etched into his face and the long scar that ran from his temple down to his jawline. "I have a need for an assistant," he said plainly. "I do not mean the type that only organizes paperwork. I require someone who can decipher people, who can feel danger before it fully arrives, and who can maintain their composure under extreme duress." The room started to spin for Celine. "You are asking me to work as your assistant? I will personally train you," Stellan declared, his voice leaving no room for refusal. "You are going to learn how to interpret individuals, spot falsehoods, and deconstruct situations. You will attend meetings with me and then report what you have seen. Your compensation will be 5 times what you are earning now. And Fern will be provided with absolutely everything she could ever need. Celine's first instinct was to say no. She wanted to tell him she had no desire to be pulled any deeper into his dangerous world. But then her thoughts turned to Fern. She remembered nights when her daughter was sick and the deeply uncertain future that would be waiting for them if Celine had no stable ground to build on. Then she thought of Stellan, the very man who had stayed up through the entire night just to hold her daughter. The man who had spoken to Fern in soft whispers, as if the child was the most valuable thing in the entire world. "Very well," she answered, her voice sounding much more confident than she felt. "I will do it." Stellan inclined his head as if he never had any doubt about what her answer would be. "We begin our work tomorrow." As Celine exited his office, she was acutely aware that she had just crossed a threshold and could never, ever go back. 2 weeks flew by in a dizzying blur of intense lessons and constant observation. Stellan instructed Celine on how to interpret body language, how to notice the most subtle indications of a lie, and how to distinguish between simple fear and someone concealing something much more sinister. He made her watch recordings of his previous meetings and demanded that she provide a detailed analysis of every single person present in the room. She absorbed the information quickly, progressing faster than he had ever anticipated. And so, in the 3rd week, he decided it was time to put her skills to a true test in a live situation. The business meeting was held inside the estate's primary conference room. 5 different men were seated around a long, polished table made of black mahogany. There was a property developer from New York, accompanied by his 2 lawyers, and 2 other men Celine did not recognize, but immediately sensed were representatives of some larger, more organized group. She took a seat in a corner of the room with a notepad, having been introduced only as Mr. Cross's new secretary. Not a single person gave her a second glance. This was precisely the advantage Stellan was counting on. Celine observed in absolute silence, while the developer, whose name was Morrison, laid out his proposal for a luxury housing complex in the Chicago suburbs. He was a man in his middle years, dressed in a very expensive suit and wearing a smile that seemed unnaturally broad. He spoke about financial figures, potential profits, and his long-term strategic vision. His voice was as smooth and sweet as honey, but Celine could perceive other signals entirely. Morrison would moisten his lips each and every time he brought up the investment amounts, which was a classic indicator of anxiety. His eyes would shift to the right whenever he discussed the projected returns, a clear sign of fabricating information rather than remembering it. And the most significant tell of all was his right hand, which repeatedly went up to touch his collar, a common self-comforting action performed by someone who is actively being deceitful. The 2 unknown men were a completely different story. They remained perfectly still, their eyes locked on Stellan, showing absolutely no interest in the details of the presentation. They were not there for a real estate deal. Their purpose was to evaluate and to watch, and they radiated a danger that was far more significant than Morrison's. The meeting concluded after 1 hour and 30 minutes. Stellan did not make any commitment, stating only that he would review the proposal and get in touch later. Once every guest had departed, he shut the heavy conference room door and faced Celine. "Tell me what you saw." Celine took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. "Morrison is not being truthful," she started, her voice more stable than she felt. "He is lying about the investment figures and the projected profits. He displays clear signs of anxiety whenever the subject of money is raised. My assessment is that his project is in serious financial distress. It is very likely he has already lost other investors and is now desperate to find new sources of capital." Stellan remained silent, simply observing her. "His legal counsel is aware he is being dishonest," Celine pressed on. "They purposefully break eye contact whenever he starts to inflate the numbers, but they do not step in to correct him. This is because their job is to remain silent, not to ensure he tells the truth. And the other two men? Stellan prompted. Celine hesitated for only a moment. They have no interest in the real estate project. Their purpose here was to size you up. They spent the entire meeting evaluating you, watching how you responded, how you articulated your thoughts, and how you deferred making a final decision. I cannot be certain who they work for, but they are incredibly dangerous men. The one with the salt and pepper hair is especially so. He was watching you as if he were actively searching for any sign of weakness. There was a profound silence. Stellan continued to study her with that same unreadable expression. Then, he did something that almost caused Celine to stumble from her chair. He smiled. It was not the cold or cynical smile she had seen from him before, but a genuine one. It was brief, yet it was powerful enough to completely alter his scarred features. Morrison is on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. He confirmed that two of his main investors withdrew their support last month. The man is utterly desperate, and the other two individuals are indeed representatives from a Detroit Mafia family. They are currently deciding between proposing an alliance or starting a war. Your reading of the situation was flawless. A powerful wave of relief mixed with pride washed through Celine, but she carefully kept it from her expression. I had an excellent teacher, she said, her tone perfectly level. Stellan gazed at her for a long, silent moment, and his eyes held an emotion that Celine did not dare to try and identify. You are a single mother, he stated slowly and deliberately. You learned to read people so well because your very survival depended upon it. That is the reason you are so gifted. That is the reason I selected you. As he turned and walked away, Celine became aware that her heart was pounding in her chest much faster than normal. It was not because of fear, but because of something else entirely. Something she was certain she should not be starting to feel. A month went by, and Celine found herself adjusting to the new patterns of her life. She grew accustomed to the high-stakes meetings, to the constant work of reading people and analyzing their hidden motives, to the steady presence of Stellan, to the particular way he would look at her when her analysis proved to be correct, and to the brief but charged moments when their gazes would hold for just a second longer than was necessary. But she could never get used to something like this. On that particular night, Celine arrived back at her apartment much later than usual. A lengthy meeting with a group of investors from Los Angeles had continued until almost 10 o'clock in the evening, and she felt so drained that all she wanted to do was fall directly into her bed. However, as she gently pushed open the apartment door, she heard it. A quiet, warm voice singing, the sound drifting out from Fern's bedroom. Celine stopped dead in her tracks. She recognized that voice instantly. She had heard it delivering firm commands in business meetings. She had heard its tone turn to ice when dealing with his enemies. She had heard it grow soft when he was speaking directly to Fern, but she had never, ever heard it sound like this. She began to walk silently toward her daughter's room, with each footstep feeling as if she were gliding on air. The door was slightly ajar, and through that small opening, she saw something that made her heart seize in her chest. Stellan was seated in the rocking chair next to Fern's crib. He held the child securely in the crook of his arm, and the gentle yellow light from the nightlight enveloped them both like a delicate, glowing veil. And he was singing a song to her in Italian. Celine could not understand any of the words, but she did not need to. The melody itself communicated everything she needed to know. It was clearly a lullaby, one that was both sorrowful and beautiful, and it was filled with an incredible amount of love. Stellan's singing voice was not flawless. It was a little bit rough around the edges on the higher notes, but it was filled with something Celine had never detected from him before. There was tenderness, a deep vulnerability, and an unmistakable sense of longing. Fern had already been asleep for a while. Her breathing was deep and regular, her lips were slightly parted, and her tiny hand was tightly gripping onto Stellan's finger. But he did not cease his singing. He continued with his eyes closed, as if the song was not just meant for the sleeping child, but for another person, someone who was long gone. Celine remained there, afraid to make a sound, afraid to even take a breath. Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks before she was even aware that she was weeping. She was not crying out of any sadness. She was crying because she was bearing witness to something profoundly intimate, something she suspected no one else in the world had ever been allowed to see. She was seeing the true soul of Stellan Cross. The song finally concluded on a long, quiet note. Stellan's eyes opened, and for a fleeting second before his defenses went up, Celine saw it all. A pain that was deep, ancient, and had never been allowed to heal. In that instant, he noticed her presence. His gaze locked with hers through the small opening of the door, and a stillness fell over them both. Celine braced herself for his anger, expecting him to rise and leave without a sound, his usual response to anyone who got too near. He did not move. He simply stared at her, his gray eyes softening in the dim light in a way she had never witnessed. "My mother used to sing this song," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "every single night, until she no longer had the strength to sing." As if guided by an unseen force, Celine pushed the door fully open and walked into the room. She lowered herself to the floor next to his chair, sitting so close she could feel the warmth from his body. "When did she pass away?" she asked gently. "When I was 12, Stellan answered, his gaze dropping to Fern as his fingers began to unconsciously stroke the child's fine hair. "My father was the one who ended her life. He beat her to death as I stood there and watched." A chilling cold seized Celine, freezing the blood in her veins. She desperately wanted to offer some comfort, but words felt useless. No words could ever touch a wound that deep. "I tried to stop him," Stellan went on, his voice sounding distant and hollow. "I was only 12 years old, and I threw myself at him, but I was a child. I was not nearly strong enough. The only thing I could do was hold her in my arms as her life slipped away. And that song was the last thing she ever sang for me." Celine's tears now flowed freely, and she made no effort to hold them back. "I am so sorry," she breathed. "I am just so very sorry." Stellan looked directly at her, and in his eyes she saw an emotion so raw she did not dare give it a name. "You were not supposed to see this part of me," he said. "No one is." "Why not?" she asked. "Because it might make people believe I am a good man," he answered, his tone laced with bitterness. "I am not a good man, Celine. I am a monster. I have taken more lives than you could possibly comprehend." Celine met his stare, looking past the shadows and into his soul, and spoke the truth she felt. "Fern does not believe you are a monster. She looks at you as if you are the center of her entire world. And children," she added softly, "are never wrong about people." Stellan remained silent. He just held her gaze for a long moment that stretched into an eternity. Then he did something that made Celine's heart stop beating. He slowly raised his hand and brushed the tears from her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost tender, as if he were handling something incredibly fragile. "You are crying too," he murmured. "You are the first person to shed a tear for me in more than 20 years." And in that moment, sitting on the floor of her daughter's bedroom with the warmth of Stellan's fingers still lingering on her skin, Celine confronted an undeniable truth. She was in love with him. She loved the monster, and she had no idea what to do with that revelation. They sat together in a profound silence for a long time afterward. Stellan eventually lowered his hand, but he did not get up and leave as Celine had expected. Instead, he looked down at Fern, who was still sleeping peacefully in his arms, and he started to speak again. His voice was quiet and far away, as if he were reliving a memory. "I had a sister," he began. "Her name was Thistle." Celine did not dare to breathe, afraid that the smallest sound would break the spell and he would retreat into his silence. She knew, with a deep certainty, that this was a story he had never shared with another soul. "She was born when I was 12, Stellan continued, his eyes remaining on Fern's sleeping face. "The very same year my mother was killed. She gave birth to Thistle only 3 months before my father murdered her. I have always believed that was the reason he did it. He was consumed by jealousy. He could not stand that my mother loved us more than she ever loved him. He paused, his jaw clenching so tightly that Celine could see the muscles ripple. After my mother was gone, I was the one who raised Thistle, he said. My father wanted nothing to do with her. He was too consumed with building his criminal empire, with destroying lives. So there I was, a 12-year-old boy, learning how to change diapers, how to prepare formula, how to soothe a crying baby back to sleep. I sang our mother's song to her every single night. I swore to her that I would always protect her, that I would never let any harm come to her. His voice cracked on the last words. Celine felt fresh tears tracing paths down her cheeks, but she let them fall. She sat perfectly still, listening, acting as a silent witness to the immense pain he had carried alone for 2 decades. Thistle grew up, Stellan resumed, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. She had my mother's vibrant blue eyes. She was always smiling. She had this trusting nature, giving her heart to everyone, including those who did not deserve it. She was so much like Fern. He looked down at the child he was holding, and Celine saw something inside him completely shatter. So much like her that sometimes it was a physical pain just to look at her. What happened to her? Celine asked, her voice barely a whisper. Stellan's eyes closed tightly. When Thistle was 5 years old, my father started a war with a rival Mafia family. He believed he was invincible. He was mistaken. They came for us in the middle of the night. I was 17. I was downstairs when the shooting started. I immediately ran for Thistle's room, but... He stopped, and when he opened his eyes again, they were glistening with unshed tears. Celine had never witnessed him cry. She had not thought him capable of it. I was too late. She was already gone, he said, his voice fracturing like delicate glass. She was on her bed, and there was blood everywhere. Her eyes were still open. They were fixed on the doorway, as if she was waiting for me to come through it and save her. But I did not get there in time. I promised I would protect her, and I broke that promise. Tears finally escaped, rolling down Stellan's face, but he made no move to wipe them away. He just sat there, clutching Fern, weeping silently for the sister he had lost 20 years before. I held her through the entire night, he continued, his voice taking on that distant quality again. I could not bring myself to let her go. I kept thinking that if I just held on tight enough, she would wake up. She would smile and say my name just like she did every morning. But she never did. And your father? Celine asked, her heart aching because she already knew the answer. Stellan's eyes turned to black ice, and for the first time that evening, she saw the ruthless man that the entire city of Chicago was terrified of. I killed him, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was 2 years after that night. I was 19. I spent those 2 years planning, training, becoming stronger, becoming more ruthless than he ever was. Then I used the same knife he had used on my mother, and I drove it into his heart. I watched the life drain from his eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing. Not a trace of regret, not a flicker of fear, just emptiness. He turned his gaze to Celine, his eyes a storm of fire and ice. That was the day the boy I was truly died. That was the day I became a monster. I was buried with Thistle, and this thing you see now took his place. Celine slowly reached out and placed her hand over his. Stellan looked down at her fingers resting on his own, a look of disbelief on his face, as if he could not fathom why she would still want to touch him after his confession. You are not a monster, she said, her voice unwavering despite her tears. You were a 12-year-old boy, forced to raise his infant sister by himself. You were a loving brother who lost everything trying to protect her. You were a son who sought justice for his mother and sister. That is not a monster, that is a survivor. Stellan stared at her for a long, quiet moment, and Celine saw a subtle change in his eyes. It was not much. It was just a thin sliver of light piercing through a lifetime of darkness. Fern looks at me like I am a good man. She looks at me just like Thistle used to, he said, the words sounding like a painful confession. And I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with that. Celine tightened her grip, her fingers lacing with his. You just keep being the man that Fern sees, she replied softly. That is all you need to do. And there in that quiet room, bathed in shadow and soft light, with Fern sleeping soundly between them, Celine witnessed something she was certain no one else had ever seen. A single tear escaped and traced a path down the scarred cheek of Stellan Cross. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter who he was or what he had done, she could never walk away from him. Everything changed on a Monday morning, just 2 weeks after the night Stellan had told Celine about his sister. She was in her office, going over some documents, when the door flew open and Kier rushed in. Stellan's most loyal guard looked as though he had sprinted a full marathon. Sweat covered his brow, his eyes were wide with stress, and his jaw was clenched. The boss needs you in his office immediately, Kier said, his voice sharp with urgency. Celine did not waste time with questions. She simply stood and followed him down the hall to Stellan's office. As she entered, she found Stellan standing behind his massive desk, flanked by 5 of his most senior guards. The tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Harlan Mercer, Stellan said, his gaze locking with hers. The name fell into the silence of the room like a grenade. Celine knew the name. Everyone in Chicago's criminal underworld knew of Harlan Mercer, the powerful Mafia boss from the South Side, and Stellan's mortal enemy. His father had been an ally of Stellan's father, right up until Stellan killed his own parent and seized control of the organization. Harlan had vowed to have his revenge. For 20 long years, he had remained in the shadows, patiently building his forces. And he is finally making his move, Kier added, taking a step forward. Our informants are saying he has reached out to at least 3 other major families throughout the Midwest: Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis. They are all seriously considering forming an alliance with him against us. To what end? Celine asked, though the answer was already a cold weight in her gut. To kill me, Stellan answered, his tone chilled and hard. Harlan has no interest in my territory. He wants my life. He intends to scrub every trace of my existence from this world. Celine felt the warmth in her veins turn to frost. Every trace of him meant her. It meant Fern. We are increasing security, Stellan declared, pivoting to face his men. I want the perimeter doubled. Nothing gets in or out unless I personally approve it. Furthermore, I want guards posted at Celine and Fern's apartment around the clock. The men gave a sharp nod and moved out to execute his commands. When they were the only 2 left in the room, Celine moved toward Stellan. I need to go, she stated, her voice far more stable than she felt. If Harlan is coming after those close to you, Fern and I cannot stay. We just give him another angle to attack. We are your weakness. No, Stellan bit out instantly, his voice like the edge of a razor. You are not going anywhere. Stellan, now is not the time for a debate, she insisted. He closed the distance between them. He stood so near she could trace every detail of the scar across his face, so near she could feel the intense warmth coming from his body. Where exactly would you be safer? He demanded. Out in the world by yourself with an 11-month-old baby in your arms? Or right here, inside the most fortified estate in Chicago, surrounded by an entire force of men who would lay down their lives for you? Celine's mind raced with arguments, with the need to remind him she had survived on her own for years. But she knew, with sickening certainty, that he was right. She could never shield Fern from a man like Harlan Mercer. She could barely even protect herself. Why? She finally asked, her voice faltering. Why do you care this much about us? We are nothing to you. I am just a cleaner you took in. Why? Because your daughter looks at me as if I am a decent man, Stellan interrupted, and for the very first time, Celine detected something in his voice besides cold command. Because you were the first person to shed a tear for me in 2 decades. Because when I am near you and that little girl, I start to feel that maybe, just maybe, some part of me is not a complete monster. He raised his hand, his touch on her cheek as gentle as it had been that night in Fern's bedroom. "You are not leaving," he repeated, his words a fusion of an unbreakable order and a desperate plea. "You will remain here with me. Allow me to protect you and your child." Celine gazed into those smoldering gray eyes and understood she was incapable of refusing him. It was not out of fear, but because she had no desire to leave. "All right," she whispered softly. "We will stay." And as Stellan gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most priceless treasure on earth, Celine was certain that whatever happened next, she would never look back on this moment with regret. It was 3 days later when they discovered the traitor. Keir found the anomaly while he was reviewing all incoming and outgoing communications for the estate. A single, unknown number appeared repeatedly in the records, linked directly to Corbin, a guard who had been in Stellan's service for 8 long years. There were encrypted messages, phone calls at unusual hours, and large sums of money funneled into a hidden offshore bank account. The proof of his betrayal was undeniable. Celine was forbidden from going anywhere near the basement where they were holding Corbin. Stellan had made it an absolute rule, but she heard enough from a trembling Mrs. Thornberry, who had been unsettled all morning after she happened to walk past the basement entrance. "The sounds," she whispered, her face completely pale. "I have never in my life heard a man scream like that." Celine did not press for details. She did not want to imagine it. But when Stellan came back to the office later that afternoon, she noticed the dark stain of blood on his cuff. A stain he made no effort to hide. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window, wrapped in a heavy silence for what felt like 10 minutes before he finally spoke. "He confessed," Stellan said, his voice deep and weary. "For 3 months. He has been feeding information to Harlan for 3 solid months." Celine swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "What did he give him?" "Everything." Stellan turned to face her, and Celine saw a darkness in his eyes that was deeper and more absolute than she had ever witnessed. "My entire schedule, the details of my meetings, my business strategies." He paused, his jaw clenching tightly. "And information about you and the child." Celine felt a crushing sensation around her heart. "Harlan knows we are here. He knows all of it." Stellan began to walk toward her, and each footstep seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. "He knows this is where you live. He knows Fern is my vulnerability. He knows there is nothing I would not do to keep you both safe, and he plans to use that to destroy me." A wave of pure terror crashed over Celine. It was not fear for her own life. It was a primal fear for Fern. Her daughter was only 11 months old. She was innocent of this dark underworld, of brutal mafia wars, of men who would murder a child just to settle a score. "What happened to Corbin?" she asked, her voice quiet, already certain of the answer. Stellan met her gaze, and she saw not a single shred of remorse in his eyes. "He is no longer a problem." She gave a slow nod. She was not as shocked as she expected to be. Perhaps it was because she had understood who Stellan truly was from the very start. Perhaps she simply grasped that in his world, the price of betrayal was always paid with blood. Or perhaps it was because the very thought of someone selling secrets about her daughter to an enemy left her feeling no mercy for the traitor whatsoever. "I will keep you both safe," Stellan vowed, his hand closing over hers. "I give you my word. Even if it costs me everything I have, I will not let Harlan lay a hand on you or the child." Celine looked into his face and saw the unyielding determination burning in his eyes. She knew he believed every word. She knew he would die to uphold that promise. And that realization terrified her more than anything else, because she did not want him to die for them. She could not bear to lose him, not now. Not when she felt like she was just beginning to find him. "Do not die for us," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You have to live. Live for Fern. And live for me." Stellan stared at her for a long, silent moment, and she saw a flicker of something soft move across his steel-gray gaze. He offered no words. He simply pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if he feared it might be their last time. And Celine, held securely in the arms of a man whose hands had taken lives, finally understood that she was no longer afraid of him. Her only fear was of losing him. 1 week after Corbin's betrayal was handled, Stellan had to travel for a meeting with the Mafia leaders in Milwaukee for a critical negotiation. The entire purpose of the meeting was to prevent them from forming an alliance with Harlan Mercer. Celine pleaded to accompany him, but he firmly refused. "It is far too dangerous," he had said. "You will remain here with Fern. I will return before midnight." She did not protest, but she also found no sleep. She stayed in the apartment's living room, her gaze locked on the front door, marking every minute that crawled by. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 11 o'clock. There was no word. Her phone was gripped tightly in her hand, its screen stubbornly black, when the door to the apartment finally swung open just before midnight. Celine leaped from her seat. Stellan walked in, and her heart plunged. There was blood on his shirt, a dark stain on the sleeve of his coat, a smear on his neck, and a long, deep gash running down his left arm. Dark blood was soaking through the shredded fabric of his sleeve. Celine was at his side in an instant. "You are injured. We have to get you to a hospital." "It is nothing more than a scratch," Stellan dismissed, his voice laced with exhaustion. The discussion did not proceed as smoothly as I had hoped. One of their guards tried to demonstrate his loyalty by attacking me with a knife. He is no longer in a position to regret that choice. Celine had no thoughts for the man who was now dead. Her focus was entirely on the man standing before her, bleeding and acting as if nothing was wrong. "Sit down," she commanded, her tone sharper than she had meant for it to be. "Right now." Stellan arched a single eyebrow, a clear look of surprise that she would dare to order him around, yet he did not resist. He lowered himself onto the sofa, his eyes heavy with fatigue and something else she could not bring herself to identify. Celine quickly retrieved the first aid kit from the bathroom and came back. She knelt beside him, gently easing off his jacket and then tearing his shirt sleeve to get a better look at the injury. The wound was approximately 15 centimeters long. While it was not terribly deep, it would certainly require stitches. She provided care with focused precision. She worked without a word, cleaning away the blood, applying disinfectant, and preparing the bandage. Her hands were steady, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of her heart. She had learned these skills in medical school, in a different lifetime before her world had shattered. She never imagined she would be putting them to use, least of all on a powerful mafia boss. "You are a stubborn woman," Stellan remarked suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Celine glanced up, her gaze locking with his. He was observing her with an expression she had never witnessed on him before. It was soft, almost tender, as if he were looking at something incredibly precious. "I had a very good teacher," she managed to reply, fighting to keep her voice even while her heart raced inside her chest. Stellan did not offer a smile. He simply continued to watch her, his gray eyes seeming to search her very soul. "You were worried about me," he stated. It was not a question, but a fact. Celine paused her work and looked at him directly. "Of course I was worried," she admitted, her voice becoming softer. "Did you truly expect I would not be, knowing you were walking into a den of wolves all by yourself?" "Why?" "Because I care about you," Celine confessed. And for that one moment, she made no effort to conceal the truth. "Because Fern needs you in her life. Because I need you. Because if anything were to happen to you, I honestly do not know what I would do with myself." A profound silence filled the room. Stellan just watched her for a long time, long enough for a warm blush to creep into her cheeks, long enough for a seed of regret to sprout in her mind. Then he slowly raised his uninjured hand and rested it on her cheek, his touch just as gentle as it had been that very first night in Fern's room. "I should not be doing this," he whispered, so close that Celine could feel his warm breath against her own lips. "You are worthy of so much more than a man like me." "I do not care what I deserve," Celine replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "Let me be the one to decide that." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft, careful kiss, as if he feared she might break beneath his touch. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, and Celine felt the entire world around them simply melt away. In that moment, there was only him and her, in an apartment filled with golden light, the lingering sense of blood and antiseptic hanging in the air. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his gray eyes searching hers with an emotion she now dared to name as love. "I will protect you," he whispered with fierce intensity. "I will protect you with my very life." And Celine, with her heart feeling like it would burst from her chest, pulled his head down and kissed him once more. This kiss was not gentle. It was filled with a desperate, consuming longing and every unspoken feeling she had kept locked away for so long. She did not need him to die for her. She needed him to live for her. She needed him to live so he could hold her just like this. To live so he could kiss her with this much passion. To live so he could look at her as if she was the only thing that mattered in his world. It all came to a head on a Tuesday night, only 3 days after they had first kissed. Celine was working in Stellan's office, analyzing contracts that required her attention. Fern was safe in the apartment upstairs with Miss Hayashi watching over her. Stellan was seated behind his desk, his gray eyes focused on his laptop screen, but every few moments, his gaze would lift to her. They were just brief glances, accompanied by thin smiles that appeared and vanished in an instant. There were small, private moments that only the two of them could comprehend. The last 3 days had felt like living inside a wonderful dream. Stellan was, of course, still Stellan, appearing cold and utterly unforgiving to the rest of the world. But when he was with her, he was a completely different man. It was the slight brush of his fingers against hers as they passed in the corridor. It was a quickly stolen kiss when they found themselves in an empty hallway. It was a look filled with profound tenderness that he would give her when he believed she was not looking his way. Celine had no idea what they were building between them. She did not know what the final destination of this journey would be, but she knew with absolute certainty that she never wanted it to be over. She felt happy. For the very first time in so many years, she was genuinely and truly happy. And that was the exact moment when her entire world shattered. The sound arrived first. It was a piercing whistle that sliced through the quiet air, like death itself taking a sharp intake of breath. Then, the immense floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the office violently exploded. Shards of glass flew inward like a storm of deadly hail. Celine let out a scream, a purely instinctual reaction, raising her arms to protect her face. But she was not fast enough. Stellan launched himself over the massive desk, his body crashing into hers, forcing her down to the floor as he used his own body to shield her from the blast. Shards of glass dug deep into his back. Celine heard the sharp rip of his suit and felt his entire frame go rigid with searing pain. Yet he remained a shield. He only pulled her closer, his embrace tightening like a vice as he lowered his head, his lips brushing against her ear. He spoke through a clenched jaw, hissing the words, "Stay still. Do not make a move." At that moment, the world outside exploded in a storm of gunfire. It was not one shot, but 100, coming from the courtyard, from the gardens, from every conceivable direction. The sounds of screams, pounding feet, and revving engines confirmed their reality. The entire estate was under siege. Stellan retrieved his phone, his fingers dialing a number by sheer muscle memory. Hayashi! His voice was a shard of ice, completely unaffected by the warm blood streaming down his back. "Seal the safe room this instant. You will protect the child with your life." He cut the connection, and his gray eyes, burning like embers in the dim light, found Celine's. "Listen to me carefully," he commanded, his tone low and urgent. "You are going to crawl to that door. You will run straight back to the apartment. You will get into the safe room with Fern." He paused. "The code is 0815. Have you memorized it?" Celine could only nod, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "But I cannot leave you," she whispered. "What will you do?" Stellan's answer was simple. "I will deal with this." As he raised his head, a handgun seemed to materialize in his palm from the shadows themselves. "Go. Now." Celine's voice trembled, raw with fear. "I cannot leave you here by yourself. I just cannot." Stellan's gaze locked with hers, sharp and unyielding. "You can," he interrupted, "and you will. You will do it for Fern. She needs you right now. She cannot afford to lose her mother." Fern. The name of her daughter sliced through the thick fog of panic that clouded Celine's mind. Her baby was in the apartment. She was certainly terrified. She needed her mother more than anything. "Go," Stellan repeated. And this time, the hard edge in his voice softened, becoming as gentle as it was when he would speak to Fern. "I will find you again after this is over. I give you my word." Celine desperately wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that he had to survive this, that losing him was not an option. But the time for words had vanished. The gunfire was growing louder, closer. The screams were spreading like a plague through the estate. And Stellan was already rising to his feet, a formidable silhouette with blood painting his back and a gun held steady in his hand, moving toward the demolished window. She heard his voice cut through the night, a cold and deadly instrument that held no trace of the man who had kissed her just 3 nights ago. "You have all just made the final mistake of your lives." Then the gunfire roared like thunder, and Celine scrambled for the door. Tears poured down her face, a hot stream of grief and terror, her heart shattering with every inch she moved away from him. She ran down the long corridors, her bare feet meeting sharp glass that sliced into her skin, leaving a trail of blood on the polished marble floors. She did not feel the pain. Her mind was a loop, focused on Fern, on Stellan, on the promise he had made. "I will find you later." He was obligated to keep that promise. He had to survive. Because if he were to die, she truly did not know how she could possibly continue living. Celine ran with a speed she never knew she possessed. The hallway seemed to stretch into infinity, the overhead lights flickering as the estate's power grid failed under the assault. Gunshots echoed from all around, punctuated by screams that tore through the air, the sound of breaking glass, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The home had become a war zone. She rounded the corner into the final hallway. This was the one leading to the east wing, where her apartment and her daughter were waiting for her. 50 meters to go, then 40, then 30. Suddenly, she stopped dead, as though she had slammed into an invisible wall. 2 men stood ahead, blocking the entire corridor. They were clothed in black from head to toe, their faces concealed by masks, and they held guns aimed directly at her. One of them spoke, his voice thick with a sickening satisfaction. "There she is, the special prize the boss wanted." A wave of ice flooded Celine's veins. She took one step back, then another, but she instantly realized there was no escape. The long, empty corridor stretched out behind her, a dead end. In front of her stood 2 assassins sent by Harlan Mercer. She was completely trapped. "Take her," the second man ordered his partner. "The boss specified he wants her breathing." They began to walk toward her. Celine knew she had to react. She could not allow them to capture her. She could not let them use her as a pawn against Stellan. She absolutely could not let Fern grow up without a mother. Her eyes scanned the walls, desperately searching for any object she could use as a weapon. A decorative vase, a heavy picture frame, absolutely anything. But before she could make a move, a new force entered the hallway. A dark figure exploded from the corridor behind her. It was Stellan. He moved with the silence of a phantom, a blur of speed and lethal purpose. Before the 2 masked men could even register his presence, he was already upon them. He delivered a swift, hard strike to the first man's throat. The man collapsed, gagging for air as his weapon clattered loudly on the marble floor. The second attacker fired his gun, but Stellan was already twisting his body, the bullet merely grazing his shoulder. He then seized the gunman's arm and wrenched it with brutal force. A dry, cracking sound echoed as the bones snapped. A scream of agony was ripped from the man's throat, quickly silenced as Stellan used their own weapons to end them. 2 clean shots, 2 bodies slumping to the floor. The entire brutal sequence was over in less than 10 seconds. Celine could only stand there, her body shaking uncontrollably, her mind unable to fully comprehend what she had just witnessed. She had always been aware that Stellan was a dangerous man. She understood he was a killer. But to see it firsthand was an entirely different reality. He was savage. He was utterly without mercy. He was death itself, wearing the skin of a man. And he had just extinguished 2 lives in order to protect hers. "Go," Stellan ordered, his voice remarkably steady. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm, and pulled her into a desperate run. Fresh blood poured from the new wound on his shoulder and continued to seep from his back, but he showed no sign of slowing down. They raced through the hallways, past the grim sights of bodies lying twisted on the floor and pools of blood that were still warm on the cold marble. Celine refused to look. She kept her gaze fixed on Stellan's broad back, on the strong hand that held hers, and she just ran. When they finally arrived at the apartment, the door was already ajar. Miss Hayashi stood just inside, holding a pistol in each hand, her expression one of unnerving and absolute calm. "Where is Fern?" Stellan demanded without preamble. "In the safe room," Hayashi reported. "She is asleep. I administered a mild sedative to keep her calm." Stellan guided Celine toward the heavy steel door at the rear of the apartment. "The code," he said, reminding. With fingers that trembled violently, Celine typed in the 4 digits, 0815. The heavy door unlatched with a solid click. Inside, Fern was lying on a small cot, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and peaceful. She was completely unaware of the horrifying nightmare that was unfolding just outside. She had no concept of the blood, the death, or the violence happening around her. Celine immediately rushed to her side, gathering her daughter into her arms as tears of relief and terror streamed down her face. Fern continued her peaceful slumber, completely still. "Get inside," Stellan instructed Hayashi. "Protect them both." "And what about you?" Hayashi asked, her eyes sharp. "I have some work to finish." Stellan then turned his attention to Celine. For a single fleeting moment, the icy mask on his face dissolved completely. All that was left was the man who had sung Fern to sleep, the man who had kissed her beneath the warm, yellow glow of a lamp, the man who looked at her as if she were the center of his universe. "I will come back for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you that." Then the heavy steel door swung shut, and Celine could only sit in the silent, fortified room, holding her daughter close, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire, and praying. "Please let him survive," she whispered into Fern's soft hair. "Please let him come back to us." 20 minutes crawled by, each one feeling like 20 years. Every gunshot was a sharp knife stabbing into Celine's heart. Every distant scream felt like a personal curse. She had no way of knowing what was happening beyond that steel door. She had no idea if Stellan was alive or dead. She did not know if the room would truly hold. All she could do was hold her child, pray, and wait. The silence, when it finally arrived, was sudden and absolute. One moment, the air was filled with gunfire, shouts, and chaos. The next, there was nothing. Only a profound quiet that pressed down on Celine's chest with the weight of lead. She sat huddled in a corner of the safe room, with Fern still sleeping in her arms, her gaze locked on the impassive steel door. Ms. Hayashi stood before it, her weapons still raised, her posture alert and ready for anything. No one made a sound, no one even dared to breathe too deeply. And then they heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and they were drawing closer. Celine's grip on Fern tightened, her heart beginning to pound wildly against her ribs once more. She did not know who was approaching. She could not know if it was Stellan returning or one of his enemies who had won. She had no way of knowing whether the door would open to deliver salvation or death. 3 distinct knocks echoed against the thick steel. Then a voice came through, low, hoarse, and utterly exhausted. But it was a voice she knew, a voice that was alive. "Open the door. It is me." Celine started to sob before she even registered the tears, a complete and total breakdown of her composure. She gently placed Fern back on the bed and lunged forward, her fingers fumbling with the lock. The door swung inward, revealing Stellan standing in the doorway. He looked as if he had literally walked through the depths of hell and back. Blood was everywhere, covering his torn shirt, his face, his hands, and matting his hair. A deep gash on his forehead was bleeding down into his eye. His shoulder was a mess of torn fabric and raw, visible flesh. His expensive suit was nothing more than shredded, ruined cloth. But he was on his feet. He was breathing. He was alive. "Stellan!" Celine threw herself into his arms, not caring about the blood, not caring about the filth, not caring about anything except the fact that he was here, that he was alive, that he had returned to her just as he had promised. Stellan held her with a desperate tightness, so much so that she could hardly draw a breath. His powerful body was shaking. It was not from the cold, and it was not from blood loss. It was from something deeper, something she had never witnessed in him before. "I am so sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am sorry. This is my world, my danger. This is all my fault. You should never have had to experience this. Fern should never have been near this." She gently pressed her fingers against his lips to silence him. "We are okay," she insisted. "You protected us. You saved our lives. But I put you in this danger." "No," she countered firmly. "Harlan Mercer put us in danger, and I have a strong feeling that he is no longer going to be a problem." For a brief second, Stellan's eyes turned hard and dark. "No," he confirmed. "He is not a problem anymore." Then his expression softened completely as his gaze shifted to the small bed inside the room. Fern was awake. She was sitting up, her wide blue eyes fixed on the blood-covered man who stood in the doorway. Celine's heart clenched, fearing that Fern would be terrified, that she would start crying at the gruesome sight of him, covered in blood, riddled with wounds, with the very shadow of death clinging to him. But Fern did not cry. Instead, she slid down from the little bed and toddled straight towards Stellan, her small arms reaching up, asking to be held. Despite his bleeding arm, despite the crushing exhaustion that weighed down his entire body, Stellan bent down and lifted her up. Fern immediately wrapped her little arms around his neck, just as she always did, pressing her cheek against his shoulder. Then she pulled back slightly, her tiny face creased with genuine concern as she stared at the cut on his forehead. And then her small voice broke the silence. "Aoi." Just one word, spoken with perfect clarity. It was Fern's very first word. In that instant, Celine went completely still. Miss Hayashi froze beside her. It felt as if the entire world had paused on its axis. Fern's tiny hand reached out and gently touched the gash on Stellan's forehead. Her touch was delicate, careful, as though she was terrified of causing him more pain. "Owie," she repeated, her small voice thick with concern. "Are you hurt?" Stellan gazed down at the child he held in his arms. And at that moment, Celine witnessed something she had believed to be impossible. Tears were streaming down the face of Stellan Cross. This man, who had ended more lives than she could possibly count that very night, was weeping because an 11-month-old baby spoke for the first time. "Her first word," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Her first word is owie." "Owie," Fern said again, patting his cheek with her little hand, trying to offer him comfort. "Owie!" Stellan hugged her tighter, squeezing his eyes shut as the tears continued to fall freely. He made no attempt to hide them. He did not try to project strength. He simply stood there, covered in blood and utterly broken, holding a child who was not his own, but who loved him unconditionally. And so, he wept. "I am all right, little one," he whispered to her. "I am all right." Celine moved toward them, wrapping her arms around them both. The three of them stood together inside the cold steel safe room, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder, as the faint sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. They were a family, shattered and bleeding and far from perfect, but a family nonetheless. "Stay here with me," Stellan said, his voice sounding like a desperate prayer. "I want both of you to stay with me. Let me be the one who protects you. Let me be the one who loves you. Let me become something more than just a monster." Soline raised her head to meet his gaze, looking deep into eyes that were filled with tears and agony and a delicate, fragile hope. "You already are," she told him softly. "You have been that for a very long time. You were just the only one who could not see it." Fern tightened her small arms around both of their necks, as if she intended to never let them go. "Owie," she murmured one last time, and then a sudden smile brightened her face. "All better." And while Celine had no idea where Fern had learned that phrase or how she could possibly understand its meaning, she knew with absolute certainty that Fern was speaking directly to Stellan. "It hurts now, but it is going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay." 6 months passed. Summer arrived in Chicago, glowing with golden sunlight and caressed by a gentle breeze. The vast gardens of the Cross Estate were blooming with countless roses and lavender, their sweet perfume drifting softly through the air. Soline stood on the veranda, taking in a peaceful scene she never would have believed could be part of her life just half a year before. "She is running," she called out, a brilliant smile spreading across her face as she watched. Fern, now 17 months old, was toddling with determination across the lush green lawn. Her tiny legs were still a bit wobbly, but she remained steady and focused. A pair of small braids bounced with each determined step she took. Her pure, clear laughter echoed in the air like the sound of wind chimes. She was no longer the frail and pale baby she had once been. Her cheeks were now rosy with health. Her eyes sparkled with an undeniable love for life. Her well-being had improved dramatically thanks to constant, proper care. "I have got you now." Stellan suddenly emerged from behind a large rose bush, bending down to scoop the delighted Fern into his strong arms. He spun her around and around through the air, and Fern absolutely erupted into peals of joyous laughter, which was the most beautiful sound Soline had ever heard. On this day, Stellan was dressed in simple jeans and a plain white shirt, a stark contrast to the expensive suits he always wore for his business meetings. The scar on his face was a permanent reminder of his past, and the wound on his forehead had healed into a new, faint line, but his eyes were completely different. They were no longer cold like shards of ice, no longer empty like a deep abyss. There was a bright light inside them now. There was life, and there was so much love. "Daddy!" Fern shouted with glee, clapping her small hands against Stellan's cheeks. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Stellan froze for a moment. Even after hearing that word for the past month since Fern had started calling him that, he could never quite get used to it. Every single time, his eyes would shimmer with unshed tears. Every single time, he would hold her just a little bit tighter. "She calls me Dad," he said quietly to Soline as she walked over to join them. "She calls me Dad because you are her dad," Soline answered, wrapping her arms around both of them in a warm embrace. "You are her dad in every single way that truly matters." Stellan looked at her then, and his gaze held everything that he could not bring himself to say out loud. Gratitude, profound love, unwavering devotion, and a silent vow that he would protect them both until he took his very last breath. He remained Stellan Cross, the formidable ghost who commanded Chicago's criminal underworld. He was still dangerous, and he was still absolutely ruthless toward his enemies. But to the two precious women held safely in his arms, he was somebody entirely different. He was a father. He was a lover. He was a man who was finally learning how to truly live again after 20 long years of merely existing. Fern clapped her hands against both Stellan and Soline, grinning from ear to ear. "Daddy, Mommy, love." Three incredibly simple words, and yet, within them, they held an entire universe. All three of them laughed together, standing in that sun-drenched garden, holding on to one another, just laughing. They were a family that was built not on blood ties, but on conscious choice, on powerful love, and on the fundamental belief that every single person deserves a chance to be saved. Sometimes, the brightest light can emerge from the very darkest of places. Sometimes, salvation arrives in the small, gentle hands of a child. And sometimes, monsters do not need to be slain, they just need to be loved. Today's story has reached its conclusion, but its powerful message will remain. In this life, it is often the people who appear the most dangerous on the outside who are the ones that need love the most desperately. Sometimes, hearts that have seemed dead for a very long time can be brought back to life by the trusting and innocent gaze of a child. And sometimes, we discover our true family in the most unexpected of places. If this story has touched your heart, we invite you to please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so that more people can have the chance to listen to meaningful stories every single day. How did this particular story make you feel? Have you ever known someone who seemed cold and distant on the surface, but was hiding a wonderfully warm heart deep inside? Please share your experiences with us in the comments section below. We genuinely look forward to hearing about the feelings that come from the deepest parts of your heart. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. We wish everyone watching this the very best of health, a joyful and fulfilling life, and many peaceful, happy days with the people that you love. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our journey.